Just a reminder, so we'll be going through. I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end, or maybe we'll hit them as we go through. If you want to post something in the Q&A or into the chat, feel free. I will try to answer those. But also, we've got a lot of people here, and I know some of these people have more experience than I do. So you may be able to find answers from fellow tech people here in the chat for whatever challenge you have as well. So please feel free to share as we go along and engage. Interesting. The speaker name overlay is obstructing the captions. Oh, I can see that a little. Depends a little bit on the ratio. So you might try moving them around a little bit, but maybe that's something we can sort out. John, I'm not sure what the plan is around slide sharing, but I can tweet them out when I'm done. I'll share my Twitter handle if you want to check that out. I'll put it here real quick. And then I'll share those out when we're done here. I do want to, so let's go ahead and kick this off. I do want to share, you may have been expecting this, the amazing Sparkling Robots or Tara King was going to be delivering this session. So it is a little bait and switch. You're stuck with me. She had a bit of a family emergency, so please send her some good vibes. She can't be here right at DrupalCon at the moment. And it makes me sad, you know. It's great to do this presentation, but Tara is amazing, and so you're all missing out on hearing from her. So just want to give her a shout out. I'll be sharing this, but so much of the hard work and thought in here came from her, and so definitely, if you enjoy it, give her some thanks for that. So Tara's awesome. All right. Up next, just a little bit about me. I'm John Richards. I'm a developer advocate at Pantheon, and I live in St. Louis, Missouri. And I love conferences, things like this. Last year was my first DrupalCon. It was amazing. I was in the WordPress space before this, so especially if you have hardcore Drupal questions, I'm sure people here in the chat can sort that out. And I have some other Drupal friends who can answer those. But a lot of this stuff around dealing with mess applies across so many different areas. So hopefully you'll find it valuable regardless. So thanks for being in an inviting community. And thanks for having me here. All right, well, that's enough about me. What about you? So if you don't mind, let's use this as a chance. I miss these in-person chances to hang out. So if you can, post a little bit about yourself here in the chat. So if you would like your name and pronouns, if you would like, maybe the title and company that you're at, your current location, and then share if you've got any legacy projects you're dealing with. Feel free to put as little or as much as that as you would like. But yeah, let's get a chance to get to know each other here in the chat as we kick this off. Awesome. We've got people from all around the world here. That is incredible. Thanks, everyone. It's always a pleasure to meet you. All right, so I'm going to jump right in. So what does legacy mean? Well, there's a lot of different definitions for legacy, and they often have a little bit of a negative connotation. But for this talk, we're going to use a little bit more of a basic definition. And so a legacy project is one that's just lived a long time. Often it's a project that was built by someone who no longer works on it. We saw earlier people talking about the challenge of trying to figure out what somebody else had done. Now, legacy sites, they can get a really bad rap sometimes. I've been to lots of different sessions at camps and conferences about the new hot thing. And that's amazing. I love hearing about new technology. But that isn't always the answer. You know, we always think that this new technology will solve all of our problems and we'll finally get it right from the start. But it's a little bit of wishful thinking. You know, even if you can get a perfect plan, your understanding of a project, it's going to change over time. Websites are really organic. They're changing, and you should be willing to embrace that change. The context of it may change. The goals for the websites can change. And so if you're stuck trying to do a full website relaunch every time your goal shifts or you learn something new about your customer base and how you want to relate to them, you're going to end up spending a whole lot of money, a whole lot of time. And so what if we don't want to do that? Well, there's another way. You could attempt to triage that site. You could begin to iterate on that site and use it that way. So instead of a legacy being just a junker, our end goal here is to try and come up with that classic. Maybe it's older, but it's still useful, still embracing that design, and hopefully it's helpful. But maybe the project that you're inheriting looks a little bit more like this. You've got a junker that can barely move. It's old, it's run down. And you're like, well, John, maybe your projects can be solved that way, but you've not seen behind the curtain of what I'm dealing with. You don't know the stress here. But I'm hoping to share that with some tips, with some basic triaging, with some early steps, you can take almost any legacy project and get it cleaned up enough to be able to move to the next phase of the project. Now, I say almost any. I will admit that there are some wild exceptions out there. I once worked on a project for a company where their previous developer had baked into the website a form of extortion. If he did not put in a certain password at a location, the website application would shut down after a week. And so when they got rid of him and terminated his contract with the company, a week later, their entire process for their internal shipping and product management software all just went away. And in that case, hey, we had to start from scratch, but we didn't want to. So there are horrible cases where you may get into a spot where the only option is to burn it down and start over. But that should always be a last-ditch option. We want to try and solve these, because even in that situation, like, everything was down until the new thing could be built. And so even if you are deciding that you need to rebuild, you still need something in the meantime. So let's make sure it's something that works and can last during that time. Now, if being a legacy project isn't inherently a problem, how do we go about sorting out which of these legacy projects are okay and which one are terrible, terrible messes? So let's look at some signs of trouble. And maybe you've encountered some of these before. I see in the comment somebody saying, wow, that's criminal. Absolutely right. It did turn into a court case, and they got it sorted out through there. But of course, that was long afterwards and didn't solve the immediate needs. So we're looking at some different signs of trouble here. Are you afraid to deploy to the site? Is it slow and nobody knows why? Maybe version control is murky or non-existent. Maybe you're looking at core and you find out that it is way, 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 way out of date. Maybe the documentation in the project hasn't been touched for over a year. And of course, many of you are thinking, I just wish there was documentation. And maybe you look at the back end and you see that there's all kinds of views and they all are sharing the same name article. So you've suddenly got this hot mess. In my experience, immediately you're left with two issues of what am I going to do? The first off is that you feel totally overwhelmed and have no idea even how massive the problem is to begin. And then how do you tackle that? And then the second piece is, a lot of times they got into this state was because nobody prioritized the time or resources to fix these problems. And so you're left with not enough resources and a bunch of problems, and like, where do I start? What do I do? So hopefully this presentation can give you a little bit of a framework for prioritizing that list of problems, and a roadmap that you'll want to go down whenever you're trying to get this technical debt under control. As I said, it can be easy to daydream about throwing out the whole site and let's just start fresh. And you're like, ooh, maybe in Drupal 9, we won't have these problems. And that may be true, but let's not jump to trashing your good Drupal 7 site yet. What we're going to do is let's figure out how we could fix this up in those weak spots so that then we can begin to move on to those cool things. Maybe you can do some progressive decoupling eventually, continuous integration, or even getting it migrated onto Drupal 9. So, but we want to have a solid place before we move on to that. Oh, I appreciate all the chat here in the chat. People just commiserating. Yes, glad to hear I'm not alone in some of these struggles. All right, so we've talked about that. How do we think about this? So at Pantheon, we talk a lot about this idea called web ops. And this here diagram, we call it the web ops keys to success. And you know, this is not a Pantheon specific thing. Just calling that out. You can use this model for any site on any host in the world. But what I want to talk about here is how this model can help you as you try to figure out where to begin tackling this project. We're going to look at these 3 key areas around credibility for your website, productivity, and then the impact of it. And hopefully this framework will let you look at any site you get and begin to think about, okay, how do I begin to tackle this when I don't have any other way to approach this problem? So step 0, you know, developers, we got to start at 0, right? The very first thing you want to do when you inherit any kind of new project is going to be figuring out what the point of that project is. Now, I found that the point of the website is often something that just people take for granted. You might ask them, why do you have a website? Well, you got to have one, or maybe we've always had one, so we just keep it. But that's not a good answer. And so maybe you need to have some uncomfortable conversations with the client or whoever's on your team who's handling this. But they're trusting you to make this website awesome. And too many organizations just have a website because they think they need to have one. And so it's really important to figure out first, what is this website for? What does this website do for the organization? Is it helping to raise money? Is it selling shoes, connecting employees, building a community? There's so many different things. But before you make changes to the site, it's really, really helpful to know what that website's intended to do and let that be your guiding star for the project going forward. Now, there's some fundamental things that you could fix without knowing those, but it's really helpful to start with this first, to have that context. And sometimes when you get to choices and need to make a decision, knowing what's guiding this will make a big difference. So think about the website that you're tackling and think about what is the most important thing that your website does. So if you've got one you're working now, maybe write this down. Somebody asked, what should it do? Yeah, it very well possibly could be that your website, what it should do is not what it's currently doing. It may need to adjust. So we're going to start with this idea and let that help guide us. Now, obviously, you can inherit a site and it can be in a terrible shape. So we know this, but that didn't solve our problem. So we're going to kind of jump back to the beginning here and start at that credibility layer, as we called it. The idea here is your website can't be credible. You can't have the credibility you need if it doesn't just have some like basic table stakes. If your website's constantly going down, if it's having problems, you're not going to be able to have the credibility to begin to tackle these more important issues, like adjusting the culture or the demands needed to make the impact that you want to have. So as we jump back here and start looking at this credibility, we've got this little impact up here in the top corner, represented by this yellow circle shining down on us, kind of like the sun, so that no matter where we're at, we do want to remember that our end goal is whatever the website's impact is. Whatever the goal for the website is, we always want to be thinking about that as we move into this. So credibility layer, what can we do here to make some real choices? So the first thing you want to be thinking about is, do your developers have the tooling to regularly develop and test changes on the website? How confident, so think about this question. You're going to want to make sure that you're not working on a fragile website. If the site's constantly going down, that's a whole different story. When I first started at my previous job at a university, 2 days before I had started, they had a massive crisis where accidentally they had sent out an emergency alert across the entire university, letting everyone know that there was a security incident on campus. And everyone freaked out, clamored to get to the website, and the entire site went down. And of course, everything was hosted on one giant server, which meant the emergency response website went down as well, and all across other environments as well. And so I start my job, and the first meeting I go to outside of my specific department is a meeting to talk about this crisis of, hey, our infrastructure can't handle this. Our website went down. And so when you inherit a site, you don't know what all is going on. You've got to figure this out. You've got to jump in there. Perhaps a crisis has just happened. And you need to make sure that you have the tooling needed to make this happen. So we're looking here for a site that is not fragile. And so how do you make sure it isn't? So I'm just going to call out 4 things here that I think are quite possibly the most important things you can do when you start a site. This is what I look to when starting a site, not specifically in this order, but these 4 things are incredibly vital. And so one of these is version control. You want to make sure you can get back to a previous version if you mess it up. You want to make sure that there's a canonical place for the code so you know what the code looks like, and can work on that and make sure any developers working on this are using the same code. Do you have automated backups? If there's a disaster, can you make sure that you can restore the things that you need to? So this is kind of a quick checklist. Multiple environments. I inherited a site that had been hacked horribly that they wanted some help with. And I refused to do any work on the website until I had multiple environments. Because if a site is having problems and then you mess something up, you're going to get blamed for it. So making sure that you have a safe place to test anything before you start tearing things up is absolutely vital. And what about security updates? I mentioned the site being hacked. Obviously, they had not been updating things. So making sure that you are able to get those things updated, whether it's modules, whether it's core, to make sure that things are safe. So starting here, tackle these first. So maybe you've got that handled. Hopefully you do. That's like the lowest tier possible. Like those are just where you want to start. After that, next, let's start looking at some targets. So do you have an accessibility target? As we talk about delivering a great experience, where does the site live in that line of accessibility? Now, if you didn't get a chance to check it out earlier today, I absolutely recommend Amy June's talk about progressive accessibility. The important thing here to know with both solving the problem whenever you inherit a site that can be a mess, or when you're tackling accessibility, what's important is not a perfect plan. It's important to just have a plan and start working on it. The site may take a while to get to where it's, WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 accessible, but you could start right away and implement small things. And so pick a target and then start measuring against it. See how well you're doing. Evaluate that and continue to iterate there. So definitely check out that talk if you haven't had a chance. Do you have a performance target? It's really easy to have a website and not specifically have a target for performance. Especially, this is really important because of the so many people on mobile devices. Making sure that, like, hey, maybe it works on your local machine when you run it in your browser, because there's no travel time on the internet, and it doesn't really matter how big the image is because it's on your local machine. But when you put that up on the web, how is it doing? So having a performance target and then measuring against that is going to help make sure that you're able to measure the site and see how well it's doing. And then in this, making sure that you can handle things like traffic spikes or load testing. So the idea here is, when we talked about that kind of web ops diagram a little bit earlier, is that you want to be iterating on this and going back through. And so each time you take a pass, you can kind of improve and get deeper and deeper. There's a lot of ways that you can continue to improve performance. And so we're looking at, hey, let's do the easiest solution first, and then let's layer on that as we work on this project. And then performing those security updates. Obviously, when you get a new site that you've inherited, making sure you go through and get all of those site updates performed right away is absolutely critical. But then how do you do this on an ongoing basis? Is this a one-time update and now the site's just going to sit and languish from then on? Or is there a plan in place to make sure that it's being updated at some regular frequency? And then you can always layer on that and begin to add automation, things like that. So we talked a little bit here about that credibility layer. We've picked our goal. We're moving towards it. And we're kind of each pass trying to improve more. But up next then is this idea of productivity. How can you better collaborate across teams? How can you begin to automate tasks? You first inherit this site, you might be working by yourself, but as the site progresses, as you begin to solve those kind of lowest tier issues, those biggest obvious problems, next you want to then begin building a team of people to help manage this site. You want to begin automating those routine tasks that maybe you've been doing manually to make sure everything works, to keep things rolling forward. So you're thinking about how do you get your team to collaborate on this website? Now, as you think of, especially as you think about that impact, when we were solving problems like let's make sure we have backups, that impact maybe didn't matter as much. But now, as we start to think, okay, let's really make sure we hit those goals, we move on towards this. And then how much of your process is automated? As you begin to inherit legacy sites, especially if you are at a place where you inherited a lot of them, the amount of time that you need to invest in them isn't scalable across a bunch of sites. And so the more you can begin to automate this, and you could start with like really basic automation, talked a little bit about, okay, well, you've got some backups, can you automate those backups? But eventually, hopefully you could get to where you're automating part of your deployment process. Are you able to automate some of the website testing and quality assurance? Is it time to bring automated testing in for the code that's being written for the site? Usually when you inherit it, there might not be any tests written, but you can slowly add those in. So again, you don't want to tackle all of that out of the gate. If you get a site and it's in a horrible spot, you don't want to jump to straight into, well, I got to write some tests for this, but it should definitely be on the horizon as you take this legacy project and begin to make it something that can be useful and continue to bring value. And then that brings us back to impact here. We're back at kind of that original step that we talked about. Now, hopefully, because we've went through some of those basic processes, the site's less delicate, it's less fragile now, and we can begin to progress towards our stated goals that we had. And so are you measuring those? As you begin to go through this and make these results, is the website hitting those things that you are trying to do? Are you measuring? Are you checking? Maybe your base level is, hey, I just added some Google Analytics. Maybe you've added in Google Tag Manager, or eventually maybe you've integrated this into your whole MarTech suite. But the idea here is make sure that you're measuring. And this is a philosophy across all of these things. You want to set some targets, and then you want to start measuring them, because that's how you know if you're meeting those. Setting a target and not measuring against it doesn't provide any value. You've got to make sure that you start testing against it so you know if the changes you're making are doing improvements. And so that brings us here, as I mentioned a little bit about iteration. How often do you want to make changes to your website? As you go forward, you want to make sure the site stays up to date. So is this a weekly cadence, a monthly cadence? Maybe it's a daily cadence, but figure out what works for the site to make sure that it doesn't end up slipping back in and kind of falling away. And as you do this, that's where the measurement comes in. You can kind of look at those goals and make sure, hey, are we lining up against this? Did our changes that we made help us better reach the goals that we're looking for this site? And so now that iteration piece, we've come here, we're now at the spot where we can just begin to go through this process multiple times. And so again, we're working on that credibility. We're making sure that the infrastructure, everything is robust and continues to work well. And then we're focusing on teamwork and automation to drive that productivity. And then we're kind of, once we have that foundation, we're able to really drive the impact that we want. And by using the measurement, we can then prove like, hey, this is providing value. And then that hopefully will allow you to go back to leadership, and you can now say, hey, give me the resources I need to migrate this site over to Drupal 9, because look, hey, this website is still providing value, even though it's been around for a while. And now, hopefully, when you're done, your goal, you were able to take a junker, turn it into a classic that people can look at and say, hey, that's been around for a while, but it still provides value. It's still doing something useful, even if it takes a lot of work to get it to that spot. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening through this. I've loved all the wonderful comments in the chat. Some great music recommendations going on around collaborate and listen. So, yes. Let me check here in the Q&A. If you've got questions, feel free to post those. We've got about 5 minutes here. A shout out. We are hiring, so if you are, I'll share out the deck. But hey, we're always looking for more engineers and people across the company. And then here's, if you would like to get a copy of the slides, I will share those out on Twitter here when we're done. And thanks everyone for coming out. Yes, James. Sometimes it's just cathartic to know we aren't alone in trying to solve all of these problems. So. So we've got a question here is word of advice to the team who does get to throw away the old and start brand new. Yeah, if you are in a situation where that's happening, it's really nice to learn about why the old thing's getting thrown away to make sure those steps aren't like replicated. It can be really easy to be like, we're just making a new site because there's a new technology out there and it inherits all of the same problems that existed before. So I would just encourage you to, maybe you don't need to look over the project, but at least talking to the people who've used it and better understand why they feel this need will help make sure that the new site does not inherit those kind of challenges and flaws that were there. Great question. And then we got another question here. Are there any legacy issues that completely stumped you or you were unable to move past? I mean, I think the big one, and this, you know, I'm speaking here from WordPress, but I know this is a thing in the Drupal community as well, is whenever you have a lot of different sites and you need to migrate those for some reason. Usually it's like a political reason or like just a portfolio reason, like how do I manage this? Do I really want to manage 2 different types of sites? And how do I do this? And so I feel like sometimes there may be a need, like I've gotten stumped where I'm like, okay, I can't solve this problem. One of the ones that came up was an issue with the migration to a new PHP version. And there was some core code that relied on libraries that needed a PHP version that wasn't supported. And so then in that case, it was a process of figuring out a migration plan for those people so that they could feel supported along the way, communicating out like, hey, and this was a large group of people. So we had like, you know, like 80 different people in this environment communicating to them like, hey, we've got a deadline coming up. We're going to do our best to work with you, but we need your help. And so sometimes there's like technical gotchas that can stump you and you can be like, well, I don't want to have to, like, my only answer is to either figure out this entire library and port it or do something. So yeah, that's a challenging one. And in that case, I think just getting real with the people dealing with it, getting a realistic timeline and working together to try and solve that problem is the best way to do it. Question here on content migration strategies when older site uses loads of inline code. Ooh, that's a good one. Any content people here have advice for Ryan on how you've managed migrating content across? You know, the dirty way is to build like a custom export script, try to pull it out, and then to import it in. And I've had to do that before, but that's always feels like the last and dirtiest resort to make that happen. Oh, Marla here has a good idea of really engaging the people who manage the site, the content creators, and having them be responsible for finding it and rebuilding it on the new site. And I like that because if you're doing it at scale, it could become impossible to handle that. I've used a combination of empowering people, hiring outsourced people, and then some just like short sprints where the entire team just got together and said, let's pick a site and try and migrate those. So sometimes having multiple avenues and seeing which one works for which can be a powerful way to do that. All right, well, we are at time. Thanks, everyone, so much. If you do have more questions, I'll be over at the Pantheon booth after that. Would love to talk about it, but appreciate all the wonderful engagement and dialogue. Have a wonderful rest of your DrupalCon, and I'll share those slides out here when I drop off. Thanks, everyone.